United States Defense Industrial Base, or DIB, faces increasing challenges when it comes to cybersecurity, given the highly sensitive nature of the information that it handles and the frequency, complexity, and evolving cyber threats designed to gain access to that information and threaten national security. The recently published 2023 Threat Assessment of the U.S. intelligence community advises that, quote, China probably currently represents the broadest, most active, and persistent cyber espionage threat to U.S. government and private sector networks, unquote. Further, the FBI asserts that China, quote, is seeking to become the world's greatest superpower through predatory lending and business practices, systematic theft of intellectual property, and brazen cyber intrusions, unquote. China, Russia, and other threats, including ransomware criminals, pose a present and serious danger to the integrity of every business and to the confidentiality of information they possess and use. For more than 5 years, the Department of Defense, or DoD, has required its contractors to comply with the cyber safeguarding requirements of Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, or DFARS, Clause 252.204-7012. The Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, framework builds on the existing security requirements and, when the new regulations are finalized, will require businesses to pass external compliance assessments and meet stringent cybersecurity standards as a condition to bid on DoD contracts. Today, while the rulemaking proceeds, thousands of DIB companies are subject to cybersecurity regulations, and the DoD has increased its scrutiny of compliance against the existing standards. This has made cybersecurity hygiene and regulatory compliance more important than ever for businesses in the defense sector. Non-compliance can be treated as a breach of contract, may foreclose new opportunities in the defense supply chain, and result in lost revenue, reputational damage, and even legal and financial exposure. Hi everyone, my name is Alan Gilbert and I work at Exostar. In this interview, I'll be speaking with Bob Metzger of Rogers Joseph O'Donnell PC, an expert and recognized leader for his work on DoD cyber and supply chain security measures. Bob will share his insights into the challenges that businesses in the sector now face, what likely lies ahead, and the specific requirements tied to forthcoming CMMC compliance. He'll discuss what businesses can do to be adequately protected and achieve compliance with the present DFARS and the CMMC framework as efficiently and effectively as possible. For those of you not familiar with my guest today, Bob Metzger leads the Washington, D.C. office of Rogers Joseph O'Donnell and chairs the firm's cybersecurity and privacy practice group. Bob was a 2016 Federal 100 awardee, recognized for his ability to integrate policy, regulation, and technology. He served on the Defense Science Board Cyber Supply Chain Task Force and is a co-author of the influential August 2018 MITRE Deliver Uncompromised report. In his legal practice, Bob advises prominent companies in diverse sectors on compliance, cyber, and security subjects. He was counsel of record for Microsoft in the 2019 through 2021 JEDI bid protest litigation. He is a frequent author and speaker on cyber, supply chain, and national security subjects. It's great to speak with you today, Bob.
Thank you, Alan. It's certainly my privilege to participate in this event.
Well, thank you. To get started, I think we often assume that all companies are familiar with the current and forthcoming DoD cybersecurity regulatory landscape. But with over 200,000 companies comprising the DIB, many may not be. So let's start with some basic questions to get everyone on a level playing field. So to lead it off, why do we need cybersecurity requirements for unclassified information?
Well, the principal reason is the threat that is posed by a number of different categories of adversaries who are interested in unclassified information and will exploit it either for their benefit or financial gain or to advance the interest of a potentially hostile nation state. For a decade, perhaps more, we have known that China, among others, has been successful at what is called exfiltration or theft of sensitive but unclassified information. And China's been able to mimic some of our key defense capabilities, or it's been able to marginalize advantage that we might otherwise have because they've been able to get information about our capabilities before they're even delivered. In the last several years, we've seen a great surge in ransomware, which is ordinarily employed by criminals as a way to attack information and information systems so that they can gain from cybersecurity vulnerabilities. Typically in a ransomware attack, information is also taken. Sometimes it is made available to the public. Sometimes it is sold to hostile parties. So there are many sources of threats, and they find and create vulnerabilities, and there are adverse consequences when information is not protected.
Okay. So I think a lot of folks sometimes conflate these two terms, cybersecurity and compliance. Perhaps you could educate folks on what the difference really is between those two.
Well, it's an essential point. Compliance is typically a function of law, regulation, or contract clause. And for those companies who do business with the federal government, often, if not ordinarily, there are clauses which require you to take certain measures to protect the confidentiality of information. The compliance requirements can differ if you have only federal contract information of general significance, or if you have controlled unclassified information, which must be protected by operation of statute, regulation, or government-wide policy. Compliance typically includes some number of specific cyber measures that are expected. And without compliance, you're at risk of some contractual or other forms of legal exposure. Cybersecurity can include compliance, but it may be distinct. I often counsel companies that they should look to get insurance to protect against cyber harms. In order to get that, they'll find that typical insurance carriers are looking to see certain attributes of your information systems. They expect to verify certain cyber measures that you're taking to protect your systems and information. Those may be similar to, but overlap or even be different from the compliance obligations. You want to be both secure against cyber threats, resilient in the case that threats are successful, as well as be compliant.
Let's also just talk briefly about how, a lot of times folks look at compliance as sort of a checking the box, as opposed to cybersecurity being something that is more of an ongoing thing where you are looking for maturity rather than just a checking the box.
Well, I'm glad that you made the point. Checking the box only gets you so far. If checking the box means that you have only the veneer of cybersecurity, then you're not protected against actual threats, and you're not able to recover should such threats find you. Typically, compliance obligations reflect sets of controls or practices that were first articulated 5 or 7 years ago. It takes a long time for the stated cyber requirements that are invoked by compliance requirements for those to change. But threat actors are not so constrained. Threats change constantly, the nature of actors and their motivation. Vulnerabilities are constantly created or newly discovered, and the consequences of cyber attacks can also change. We hadn't really seen anything like Colonial Pipeline until a year or two ago. We hadn't seen anything like SolarWinds. So to me, the ultimate objective is the security of the enterprise. And that includes being compliant with the requirements of your government customer. But it's more than that. If you take a sort of static approach to cyber compliant, you may do fine if and when the assessor comes, but you may not be secure And if you are in fact vulnerable, and if an attack succeeds against you, and if you are unable to recover quickly and fully, there could be great and potentially unrecoverable damage to your enterprise.
Exactly. I think that there are a lot of companies today who are either unsure or even unaware that they may be subject to cybersecurity requirements right now. Could you just summarize for us what cybersecurity requirements are in place today and which companies are affected by them?
Well, let's focus upon companies that do business with the federal government. Essentially, any company that does business with the federal government, and there are hundreds of thousands, is going to have in it something called the FAR Basic Safeguarding Clause. And it describes protections that are expected for federal contract information. That's information which describes the nature of the contract, the purpose, the contracting parties, and some other details. Every company that has a federal contract or a flow down with that basic safeguarding clause will be expected to employ 15 described practices to protect the confidentiality of that information. And when you get a little bit more technical, those 15 practices translate into maybe 17 distinct actions. They don't look too demanding themselves, but doing them well, requires some effort and attention on the part of every company that has FCI. Let's say that there's 2 or perhaps 300,000 companies in the defense industrial base. Virtually all of those companies, and every company that gets controlled unclassified information, they're going to have present in their contract or their flow down a clause that you mentioned earlier, Alan, sorry. The DFAR is 252.204-7012 clause. That clause requires that you have adequate security to protect the confidentiality of controlled unclassified information. Adequate security is determined by reference to a special publication 800-171 of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Now, to get back to the core of your question, though, by now, virtually anyone who sells anything to the Department of Defense ought to be aware that it's very likely, near certain, that that 7012 clause will be present in their contract. And that clause imposes compliance obligations and directs certain measures that must be taken to be secure.
So some companies, I think, consider themselves to be far down the DoD supply chain. They're not primes. They're not even direct subs. They may be many layers down, and they may be under the impression that they aren't subject to any of these requirements, or perhaps that they're subject to fewer of them. So perhaps you can clear up the perception here. Are some companies in the DIB subject to greater or lesser requirements than others?
Yes. If a company has no controlled unclassified information and does not anticipate seeking future work that would cause it to receive CUI, well, then it's going to be subject only to that FAR Basic Safeguarding Clause. But any company at any level that has controlled unclassified information is subject to the more demanding requirements of 7012. I understand that there's a notion that some smaller companies, or some that are far down the supply chain, don't think that this reaches them, but typically it does. And I also understand that many smaller and medium-sized businesses can struggle with what they perceive to be the expense in resources, people, funds, technology to satisfy the cyber requirements. Let's leave aside for the moment some of the different ways in which you can overcome those objections. But a central point is this: those adversaries or ransomware actors who mount cyber attacks, they are relatively less likely to go after the bigger and better defended companies. They are looking for the low-hanging fruit. Ransomware actors typically are going after companies that have poor defenses and where the investment they need to make to succeed with a ransomware attack is slight. That includes many small companies and many service providers, even law firms. And on the nation state side, It's been known for some time that China and other hostile states are eager to find out areas of innovation that exist in our smaller and medium-sized businesses, where they also know those businesses may be less defended. And just this week, the CIO of the Department of Defense, John Sherman, was testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And he mentioned that one of the reasons that so-called advanced persistent threats of nation-state rivals such as China, one of the reasons that they often will go after lower tier companies in a supply chain is not only to get information from those companies that will be valuable, but to find in those companies means of access or network-enabled routes to go higher in the supply chain, even to DoD, so that they look for the vulnerability in the lower tier in order to move their attack laterally or vertically to get others in the supply chain.
So if our adversaries are going for what you call the low-hanging fruit, which isn't necessarily the obvious fruit, it may be these smaller companies that are further down the supply chain, and they use that as an entry point. What does that mean with respect to cyber incident reporting? And what would be involved if a company were to recognize that they've been breached?
Well, sometimes I feel that cyber incident reporting is the under-recognized element of the compliance requirements that DoD and the federal government impose. When we look at that 7012 clause, there really are two parts to it. There are the security measures, which are in parts A through and B of 7012, and then there are the incident reporting requirements that are in C through G. It has been very important to DoD from the outset that companies report within 72 hours cyber events of which they become aware. And the reason has never been to punish companies. It is because the exfiltration or loss of confidentiality of CUI may have adverse consequences upon mission holders and warfighters. DoD has said from the beginning and still intends that the most important reason for companies to inform it is so that DoD can do damage assessment and understand whether there might be compromise to the capabilities of the mission holders. Now, it gets much more complicated, as all of these things do. If you have a ransomware attack, you will know essentially instantly when you attempt to go onto your system and you are greeted by a message that says your system is locked up. If you have a ransomware attack and you can't get on your system, or you are told that all of your information has been removed and encrypted, you'll know. Those things are reportable as incidents, no question, under that 7012 clause. The more difficult problem is when a state actor, such as an advanced persistent threat, mounts the attack. Often, those actors don't want you to know that they have made an attack. You may not find out from anything that you learn yourself. You may not find out you've been attacked unless you're told by a higher tier company with more sophisticated tools, or even by the government. So nonetheless, it's important to be alert and monitor your networks, to have internal process, guidelines, and procedures. You never want to learn how to handle an incident in terms of response, or how to make a timely report at the moment that it happens, because things can happen very quickly and there can be many actions and interests that are affected almost instantly. And you want to have these things thought through, often practiced in advance of the event.
In the course of our conversation so far, you've made a few references to ongoing exfiltration of information. So from the DoD's perspective, what's missing from the current cybersecurity requirements that may be allowing that kind of activity to continue at the rate that it is?
Well, it's evident from the CMMC initiative that DoD has not been satisfied with the achieved and sustained security of its industrial base. The methods that we've used so far essentially impose these NIST requirements upon companies. and they require that companies do a self-assessment and report those scores, into a DoD database. But this is all self-performed and self-attested. DoD has concluded that it can't have great confidence in the self-attested results of companies examining their own cyber compliance. And so through CMMC, DoD has sought to validate or verify the claimed cyber accomplishments of its contractors, because the essence of CMMC is the addition of a mechanism for a third-party cyber assessment and eventually a requirement that you satisfy that assessment and receive a certification as a condition of eligibility for new business. Now, I could say that there are other bigger and more complex things that DoD might do if it were trying to deal with the nation-state threats. But for the moment, I think the highest priority for the department is to have higher confidence that more of its suppliers at any tier are in fact getting the baseline right, and also to be sure that everyone with these requirements knows how to report an incident and does so when they learn of it.
Okay, so you referenced CMMC, which some people are aware of. Some people know the acronym and toss it around somewhat cavalierly. But maybe just take one small step back and let's talk a little bit about what CMMC really is, how specifically it addresses the shortcomings that we're seeing today, and what kind of timeline are we looking at for it to take effect?
Well, CMMC, as first announced 2 or 3 years ago, was a maturity model that had 5 different levels of maturity. And it included, for most of the defense industrial base, not just the 110 individual requirements of the standard NIST 800-171. It added another 20. And then it called for strata above that middle level that went up to much more demanding cyber accomplishments. Well, about 2 years ago, DoD decided that that was just too arduous for too many companies and too complex. And DoD was concerned that it would be impossible for some small businesses and might drive smaller businesses and innovators away from or keep them out of the defense industrial base. So as revised, CMMC now has 3 levels, only one of which is relevant for companies with CUI, and that's level 2. Level 2 for CMMC says, as before, that you have to provide adequate security, relying upon the 110 individually enumerated requirements in SP 800-171. Those are divided among 14 families of cyber controls. CMMC Level 2 also requires that you promptly report incidents should they occur. Now, the next step that occurs when new regulations are finalized and effective is that companies will be expected to have that third-party assessment. And CMMC includes the apparatus to accredit third-party assessors and to make them available to companies to conduct assessments that are either accepted now or can be accepted in the future by DoD. So the big difference between today and where we will be when CMMC 2.0 is in place is that under the new regulations, there will be all of the oversight and administration, rules of application and guidelines for the application of third-party assessments to validate that companies at that level 2 who have CUI, in fact, are satisfying the requirements. And just to add one level of further detail, DoD knows that there is a limited number of such assessors today. That number is growing. And they also know that some companies have information of higher impact than other companies. And they will recognize that they can't impose the more demanding assessment requirement upon all the companies at once. They won't. They will be selective and have some priorities as to who must get assessment first. But to distill it all, the short form is this. Under 7012, which is in force today, you have to satisfy the 110 requirements of NIST 800-171. And under the 1719 regulation, also in effect today, you have to do a self-assessment using a prescribed DoD assessment methodology and report that self-assessment, your score, into the Supplier Performance Risk System, or SIPRS. You have to put the score in for each system that you use, and you have to tell DoD in the same report when you expect to close any gaps that you have found in your self-assessment. Also in place today is another clause, 7020, which gives DoD the right to do a medium assessment, which is where they call you to see if you have a basis to support the score that you submitted, or even a high assessment, where DoD's DIBCAC unit will come visit you for as long as 5 days to verify that what you've said you do, you do.
You spoke to the evolution of CMMC from version 1 to version 2, and that the DoD listened to the concerns of the DIB in making these changes. Do you feel like there are any additional concerns of industry, and how might they be resolved?
Yes, there are concerns. I think the biggest concern for industry still is the feasibility and affordability of these requirements for small and medium-sized businesses. And DoD's put a lot of effort into making training resources available. And there are resources within DoD and the intelligence community that can offer practical advice to companies. But it remains a source of concern to the department, as well as to Congress, that CMMC be achievable. And one of the things that this has led to is that the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and in particular the Office of the DoD CIO, they've been looking increasingly at how greater use might be made of cloud-based solutions or enclaves that are hosted within or hosted by cloud solution providers. And the fundamental reason for that is pretty simple. You know, if you think that there are 300,000 companies that are in the DIB and might be subject to these rules, each of them has different business circumstances. Well, if you take the historical approach and you essentially try to protect the perimeter of your information system, one problem is that that's easily overcome by contemporary threat actors. The other problem is that if you're trying to build efficient security with an on-premises system, you're going to spend a lot of stuff. You're going to spend a lot to achieve capabilities that are readily available from any number of third-party service providers, and which those providers can deliver, at scale, with economy, and with much higher technology than is likely to be affordable or otherwise achievable by a smaller company. It only makes sense for companies to be looking to leverage the scale and the higher technical capabilities of cloud service providers. You may not know this, but in 2016, I wrote a nearly, 15,000 word white paper that was sponsored by Exostar on the reasons that DoD should be encouraging most of its supply chain to be looking towards cloud solutions. Rather than invent things yourself for yourself, why not take advantage as much as you can of things that are already invented, in being, in place, in operation, monitored and improving, that are offered by cloud service providers and others who offer managed security or managed information services.
Okay, Bob, you make a great point there. I'm wondering, are there some other smart strategies that companies can look to in order to elevate and accelerate their compliance while at the same time reducing their vulnerability to ransomware and other threats, above and beyond maybe trying to leverage cloud service providers? What other options are out there for folks to be able to still improve themselves?
Everybody's circumstance differs, but I cannot think of any company that should not want cyber insurance if they can get it. And these days, in order to get cyber insurance, you will be subject to due diligence by the insurance underwriter or carrier. They're going to want to see certain things. They may be testing your network, essentially doing checks around its perimeter for vulnerable ports. They're going to tell you some things that you have to have in order to get that insurance. And those are things that you're going to start with, because if you can afford to get good coverage with minimal exclusions. That's really important because no matter how good your defenses are, there will be some actors who have novel techniques or some who are just so sophisticated that few, if any, businesses can defeat their penetration. Getting that insurance is key. So I actually tell many clients that they should be thinking about what it takes to get good insurance that they can afford and what it will take to sustain that insurance. And those measures will all overlap with the things that compliance requires, but I'd give them priority. I might spend more money on those things that make you insurable first. Then I want to think about outcomes. In other words, I want to look at the customers where the loss of confidential information, if I lose confidential information for certain customers, the impact will be worse. I'd like to know which of my customers, government or otherwise, will be most injured if I am disrupted because of a ransomware attack, or if I lose the confidentiality of information they gave me. I like to secure against the knowable worst case outcomes. And then beyond that, I always look to encryption. When you look at ransomware actors, Alan, it's a business decision. How much does it take for them to get into your system? How much can they learn about you? How much money can they get? And if it turns out that the information that they'd like to steal is encrypted such that they can never use it or sell it, well, that makes you an unattractive target, and they are at least somewhat likely to go elsewhere. Encryption of the information that you host, communicate, and process is very important. Encryption of your emails also is important because it's been said many, many times that adversaries are especially interested in what they can glean from exfiltrated or stolen emails and their attachments. What we have to remember now that with big data and data analytics, the more sophisticated attackers are looking to harvest massive amounts of your data because they have the means to go through it. And some of them have the patience to go through much data assembled from many targets before they hatch their next plan of action or attack.
So you touched on a few things there that companies might do proactively, cyber insurance and encryption. What about things that they don't do? What acts or omissions might expose companies to the greatest compliance or legal risk?
Well, I'd mentioned that 7012 is a contract clause in virtually every contract that anyone at any level of the defense supply chain has. That requires you to conform to NIST SP 800-171. And I also mentioned the 7019 clause that says that you must conduct a self-assessment using this DoD assessment methodology, and you must report your self-assessed score to the SIPR system. An omission that creates great exposure is failure to do that scoring and submit a score. My reading of relevant documentation, and I looked at some of it in the last day, is that strictly speaking, a contracting officer should not award a contract to anyone who has the 7012 clause who has not done a self-assessment and submitted a score. But in the same group of things that are really bad, you do not want to submit a score that you cannot support. You don't want to make an exaggerated claim of your security. You do not want to avoid, understate, or mislead the government as to what you do or don't. Although the numbers of companies who have been checked by DCMA is relatively small, it is increasing. And it is very clear that you suffer contractual exposure to your government customer or to a prime if you are misleading the government in the score that you claim and post in SIPRs. Government's made it very clear that if it finds that you have misrepresented your score, it has the right perhaps to suspend progress payments if you're a prime contractor. It might demand corrective action. It could seek damages if it can calculate them, and it can terminate you. And if you were to get terminated for a misleading SIPR score, well, that's going to show up in other parts of the SIPR system, and that will make it unlikely you will qualify as a responsible contractor, and the government will not make awards to companies who are found non-responsible. But there's even a bigger threat beyond that potentially. It doesn't happen every day, and it doesn't happen, absent severe circumstances. But the Department of Justice, about a year and a half ago, announced a civil cyber fraud initiative where it said that it was going to try to bring actions under the False Claims Act against companies who knowingly misrepresent their cyber compliance, against companies who say that they are doing some things and who are not, against companies who know they have a reportable event and do not report it. And although not every company is going to face that kind of severe challenge, from personal experience, I can tell you that you never want to be the company trying to explain or defend yourself against allegations of a false claim. Even if the allegations are not meritorious, it's a very expensive and disruptive process. It's much better to spend the money on security, both to establish it at the level of compliance and to sustain and improve it over time.
Bob, you've done a fantastic job of laying out the landscape of what things look like today and what companies that are part of the DIB are required to do today. And again, I think a lot of folks, this is going to be an eye-opener in terms of the breadth and the depth of the requirements to which they are subject and to which it is increasingly likely that they may find themselves held accountable to. But let's turn our attention now to what's coming, with regard to CMMC. Perhaps we can dig a little bit deeper there. And some of this may reinforce some of the answers that you provided to some of those early questions, but let's turn our attention to CMMC. So I guess first off, let's be clear about who CMMC applies to. Does it apply to companies that don't contract directly to the DoD or even to a prime contractor if they're far down the supply chain?
Let's stop there. So if you don't contract to DoD at all, and you don't plan to, then CMMC is not likely to apply to you. In fact, if the 7012 clause shows up in your contract, but you never have any form of CUI, you have a pretty good argument that you're not obliged to do something to protect an information type that you do not possess. You want to be careful with that explanation or rationale, because a lot of companies will find that they're not contracting with DoD today, and some will find that they're not getting CUI today, but they might want to have such a contract in a month or 6 months. Or they might find that an amendment to an existing contract suddenly causes them to receive CUI from the government or a higher tier prime. Well, once you have that CUI, suddenly all those obligations are present. I personally don't think these obligations are that demanding, and really they're way short of what more sophisticated protective measures are. Let's think of 171 as a baseline. If you contemplate doing business with the Department of Defense, and it is possible that you will have a contract or subcontract that provides you with CUI, the only smart move is to get to work now to be compliant. You don't have to do it tomorrow. It doesn't have to be accomplished overnight. It can be a process. You can make time-phased decisions on investment, but you should assume that it's going to take you 12 to 18 months to go from nothing to compliance, unless you go with some sort of prepackaged enclave solution. And if it's the case that it's going to take time to be compliant, there's no better time than the present to get started. And it isn't just about compliance, because the measures you take to become compliant will in fact make you more robust against cyber attacks, reduce but not eliminate your cyber vulnerability, and hopefully improve your ability to recover and be resilient should an attack occur.
But does CMMC apply to companies that are contracting with the DoD that aren't handling CUI?
Generally, the answer would be no. Those companies would be subject to the basic safeguarding clause that I mentioned. And there are, of the 110 requirements in NIST SP 800-171 that apply to companies that have CUI, 17 of those apply to companies who don't have CUI and only have federal contract information. So if you're doing work for DoD that may include, say, providing medical equipment or some form of services, and you don't see CUI, you're very likely still to get federal contract information as described in that basic safeguarding clause, and you do not get a free pass to do nothing. You have to do that lesser set, which translates to 17 of the CUI requirements.
Is that not equivalent to CMMC maturity level 1?
Actually, it is equivalent to CMMC maturity level 1, but CMMC is a phrase or concept used to describe a lot of things. The whole ecosystem of CMMC becomes applicable or operable, when the new regulations are out. But they're not out. They're in the works, and they may not become final until sometime next year. But don't make the mistake of thinking that the delay in the 2.0 regulations means there's nothing to do now. That is just wrong. That basic safeguarding clause is in your contract now. And if CMMC was a term that never was invented, it still would be in your contract. And those 17 obligations would be imposed upon you today. And you signed a contract, which is an implied representation that you will do the things that the contract says you are supposed to do. By the same token, CMMC includes, that 7012 clause for, the 7012 clause to deliver adequate security. And CMMC encompasses 7019 self-reporting to SIPRs, and it embraces 7020, agreeing that DoD can audit or assess your compliance. All that stuff is in being right now. Those are not things that we're waiting to happen. They are in being, in place, in your contract, and legally enforceable obligations. The CMMC stuff that involves the big ecosystem of assessors and the requirement that you get a certification after an assessment, that's in the works, and I expect it will come. But the fact that it isn't all in being now hardly justifies really any company from taking a blind eye to the requirements that are in its present contracts.
You've really made it clear that for the last several years, a great many companies have been subject to DFARS Clause 7012, which incorporates the 110 controls in NIST 800-171. So these requirements have been in place for several years. And when we look at CMMC and maturity level 2, for the moment at least, is mapping pretty much as a one-to-one to NIST 800-171, people might start to get the impression that cyber requirements are static. So I'd like to dig in a little bit there. Are cyber requirements static? And if they aren't, what's going to determine the requirements and how might they change in the coming year, 2, or 3?
Well, there's a lot to that question. So there's a difference between compliance requirements that can be slow to evolve and actual security objectives that are dynamic, always have been, always will be. So when I was on the Defense Science Board study, we were looking at cyber physical systems. And one of the calculus that we used was to assess risk as a function of threat and vulnerabilities and consequence. Well, if we assume that the 7012 clause was first put in contract 6 years ago, it's pretty much the same clause now that it was then. But over the last six years, threats have changed a whole lot. There are whole new categories of threat actors, such as ransomware criminals who just weren't there. And the means or tactics, techniques, and procedures of the threat actors have evolved fantastically. Who would have expected a software supply chain attack like SolarWinds until after we learned about it, which was a year after it occurred? Moreover, vulnerabilities continue to be created and exploited, or discovered and exploited, by a gigantic range of threat actors. So many things have happened, showing us where problems can be found or made, that those things just weren't present even a year ago, even 2 years ago. Unfortunately, bad novelties are kind of the name of the game. And we've learned of consequences that are so different than what we expected when that regulation was first in place. We really weren't thinking that people would hijack your system and make you pay money to unencrypt your data. We weren't thinking that people would take your data and put it on the dark web and try to sell it. We weren't thinking that advanced persistent threat actors would try to use in entree into your system as a way to get up the chain of your networks into a higher tier prime or the government. All those things are happening. So in that sense, is the threat environment, are the risks of cyber, are they static? Absolutely not. And that means that a company that actually wants to sustain enterprise security, and a company that really takes seriously the objective of protecting its defense customers, private sector or public, from a cyber attack upon them, they need to be aware of the constant change. They need to be aware of the changing risk environment, and they never need to think that enough is really just enough. Because this is an environment, this is a universe where things only get more complicated, more difficult, and in a sense, more dangerous, especially now, Alan, where we have a geopolitical climate with a much higher degree of hostility, among major nation states than we had 5 or 6 years ago. Sure, I mean, you can decide to do the minimum and you might get lucky and nobody will attack you, or perhaps somebody will attack you and you will not know it. But if it goes the other way and you are attacked and that attack has a consequence, companies should understand it's not just a regulatory violation. If you suffer a ransomware attack of many types and as a representative, you can be out of business. You can incur a range of costs and liabilities so quickly it'll make your head spin. And for many companies, even insurance may not be enough, and there can be a loss of business continuity. It is a hazardous move to figure that you're so small in the supply chain that nobody will bother you. You're not. The ransomware criminals are not looking to get the biggest people, although they sometimes do it for certain effects. You have to assume that no matter where you are in the supply chain, it can happen to you. And if you assume that it won't, well, you might get lucky. But if you're not lucky, it's going to be devastating. Let me mention one other thing. So I mentioned that, the baseline cyber requirement is this NIST special publication, SB 800-171. It has 110 requirements. They're each expressed in a single sentence, although there's all kinds of elaboration in different documents around them. I think it was first published 6 or 7 years ago. And and at the time, it really wasn't the most demanding set of requirements, but it was thought to be a baseline that most companies, in the commercial world would already satisfy. People have been surprised. It's been harder to satisfy it than was originally expected. Well, 171 was written around a different threat set, different understanding of vulnerabilities, and different experience with consequences. So NIST is now working to revise SB 800-171. They are working on a revision 3. NIST has said that they expect they may have that revision 3 complete by the end of this year. It will not instantaneously be imposed upon defense contractors who have that 7012 clause. Yes, I know you could read that clause that way, but DoD is a smart enterprise overall, allowing for exceptions. DoD is not suddenly going to announce to hundreds of thousands of companies that a changed revision 3 to 171 is now required. It won't happen that way. They'll get something called a deviation, and they're going to use that. They're going to come up with a method that will gradually impose the changes to 171 and Rev 3, not instantaneously. And even then, those changes will be incremental and perhaps even optional, not mandatory. Everybody understands that 171 has proven to be hard for many companies. They're not going to suddenly take a big kick upstairs and make it way harder still. They may want you to do better. They should. They may expect that you eventually will do better, but it will be a process. Now, what if you're really trying to protect against the most sophisticated threats? Is 171 going to do it? No. I mean, 171 is a baseline. It's good. Certain other measures, as insurance companies expect, better. But, if you're doing stuff that's of high impact or critical technology for the Department of Defense or the intelligence community, you could anticipate that they're going to expect things that are more difficult, more secure. And those are presently expressed at level 3 of CMMC and in a different NIST publication, SP 800-172. At this point in time, rarely if ever does DoD impose or require 172 contractually. I expect that they will start to do so, especially if they want to curb the success of advanced persistent threat or nation state actors. Won't be everybody, but it will be some of you, and you should be alert to ways in which you can move in that direction to be more secure, even than 171 will give you as a baseline.
Boy, I'm really glad you went there, Bob. You actually kind of stole my follow-on question, but I still want to look at what you were just talking about through a slightly different lens, and that is as NIST works to come out with Rev 3 of Special Publication 800-171, and the DoD continues its process of rulemaking around CMMC, and you've got the alignment between CMMC level 2, maturity level 2, and NIST SP 800-171. If Rev 3 comes out of 800-171 as the rulemaking continues, what kind of impact might that have on CMMC maturity level 2? Would it be aligned to Rev 2 or Rev 3?
It will be managed. I mean, the language in the 7012 clause says that you have to use the version of SP 800-171 that is in effect as of the time you take the contract with the clause. And so if R3 were to become effective on November 1st of 2023, arguably anybody who got a new solicitation, amendment, or contract with the same 7012 clause suddenly would find themselves subject to R3. It's not going to happen that way. That's what I mentioned is, deviation. DoD has done this sort of things before. It will see that there could be an impact of excess breadth or excess uncertainty, cost, and disruption. So what will happen is DoD will say, R3 is out there now. We're going to be calling upon people to use it, but we're going to suspend for some period of time from the effective date of the NIST publication, the date when it has to be used to satisfy 7012. It will not be precipitous. They're not crazy. People are having enough trouble now satisfying revision 2. They're not going to suddenly pull the pin on a grenade and tell thousands of companies that as of the next contract mod or new contract, they have to satisfy level 3. Now, I'm predicting, nobody at DoD has told me this, but I think my predictions are right here. Will companies in a year or two be expected to satisfy revision 3? Yes. Will revision 3 be a radical departure from revision 2 that's in force now? No. I think revision 3 will have some things that improve and clarify it. That's good. Some new things. I think it will perhaps incorporate some of the privacy and supply chain features of its, let's call it Big Brother companion, SP 853 revision 5. It'll incorporate some of those things, and I expect that there will actually be an overlay available, which will say to companies that, well, you have to satisfy essentially the same baseline as 171R2 that you have today. But here's an overlay, which we're going to pull from 853R5, and these are things that you could do if you want to do it better. And that overlay is going to be important, if I'm right, because that's going to give companies that path to go from the baseline of 171 compliance and to improve over time. And I hope they do something like that. 171 is a fine baseline, but it's showing a little bit of, age. And we can and should do better, need to do better in order to protect against present risks.
Fantastic. You've spoken at length about the self-assessments that are required by Clause 7012, as well as the reporting of 7019 and the possible audit by the DoD that comes with Clause 7020. As we look to CMMC, maturity level 1, the companies that are going to be required to come in and get an accreditation at that level will have the option to self-assess, and it's still unclear whether some companies at maturity level 2 will have the opportunity to self-assess as well. But I'd like to talk a little bit about how does self-assessment change, or does it change when we look to CMMC? What's involved? Who would check a self-assessment, and what would happen if that self-assessment turned out to be incorrect?
Well, first, the self-assessment that you report in a CIPRS score, you can change tomorrow. So if you find out something bad about your security and your actual assessment goes down, you can contact the SIPR's system and change the score. If you have a plan with 3 milestones over the next quarter to close up certain gaps and improve your score, you can update the score every quarter. Now, what happens, you said, who checks? Well, under the present regime, there's no official check of everyone who does a self-assessment and reports a SIPR score. But under 7020, the DIBCAC unit of the Defense Contract Management Agency has the authority to do medium assessments, and they are using it. They call companies who have a SIPR score, and they ask, do you have a self-assessment? Do you have a system security plan? We'd like to see it. You post a score of 104. How do you support that? Show us the SSP and the self-assessment that prove it, that support it. Those calls are being made. They are increasing that activity. And already DCMA and DIBCAC have been reporting the experience that a very significant number of companies have overstated their scores. That is not going to result in instantaneous sanction, but it is a bad thing. And I would certainly expect that DoD will be looking for ways to use its contractual authorities and investigative authorities to cause some adverse consequence to attach to companies who just can't support the scores they have posted. And the worst of all circumstances, as suggested earlier, is if you post a 110 score, you've never done a self-assessment, and you don't have a system security plan. That starts to edge towards knowing misrepresentation to the government of information that figures into contract evaluation and award. As a lawyer with experience in False Claims Act cases, I would not recommend that you do that. That is a gigantic risk to take, not a good plan. Now, once the new rules are, let's talk about the interval period. So we have in place now something called the Joint Surveillance Assessment. And this takes certified third-party assessors who are accredited by the Cyber AB. And this allows those assessors to work in conjunction with DoD's DIBCAC unit to perform assessments just like the DIBCAC High assessment that DIBCAC used to do itself. Well, the DIBCAC High assessment was done by a small group of highly trained DoD employees, and it focused at first on large companies. And maybe 300 or 400 of those have been done over the last 3 years. I have advised quite a few companies that have gone through it. Well, under the Joint Surveillance Assessment, suddenly the resource base to do these assessments is increased because DIBCAC takes kind of an oversight role, but the actual assessment is done by a C3PAO. And I think there are close to 40 C3PAO organizations now. The more companies are able to get a joint surveillance assessment done, which is essentially tantamount to having DIBCAC do it through a private assessor. And when you're done, if you pass, you get something called a letter of attestation that you can show to people that shows that you passed the DIBCAC High assessment. Moreover, the result of that assessment should turn up in your SIPR score. You can post it yourself. And it's expected that a positive result on a joint surveillance assessment will be something that essentially extends the period before you need a formal new assessment once the CMMC rules are in place. It's a great opportunity for companies to show that they really are doing it right and that they are not only compliant, but they can show it, prove it. Because, if you're a middle-sized contractor and you post a 110 score, well, your prime contractor may say, well, that's great that you claim that, but how do I know? Well, if you've been through a joint surveillance assessment and you can show them that letter of attestation, you've got a credential of some validity with an independent origin that has some recognition from DoD. Not trivial. So I encourage companies, large and small, if they're ready to go through this joint surveillance assessment. Now, when the new rules, the 2.0 rules, are actually in place, DoD is not going to allow the situation to be one where thousands and thousands of companies are trying to get hundreds of assessors to do their assessment instantly. It can't happen that way. So there's going to be management of the rollout so that assessments there'll be a specific contract clause, probably DFARS 252, 204-7021. That 21 clause will be put into particular contracts when DoD has decided that it needs to have that subcontract or that supply chain be among those who are first assessed. And they'll be looking, I think, to high impact programs and critical technologies, not to everything and anybody. Does that mean that any of you who are DoD contractors can hope never to have a required assessment? Well, you can hope that. But if you're doing work of any significance for DoD, especially that which might affect a mission holder, affect a warfighter, which involves operationally critical support, that is an enabling or distinctive technology. As the importance of your work, whether for operations or for capabilities or for research, as the importance of your work increases, you become a little bit more likely to see that 21 clause in a required assessment sooner. Why? Because they will care more that you and your supply chain are demonstrably secure sooner than they will care for some others.
So you've identified an opportunity for companies who feel they may be ready to be proactive through the joint surveillance assessment and get ahead of the game. I think there are a lot of companies, though, who have a lot of fear and uncertainty around how a third-party assessment would work. So could you just get into a little bit of a description of how a CMMC third-party assessment would work and what would happen to a company if they were to not pass?
Well, in a joint surveillance assessment, if there are issues that are identified, you may get some period of time in which you are to provide redress to those. And I've seen it happen. I've advised companies that have been through that. There will be certain types of requirements where you can have a plan of action and milestones. It's typically expected that you'll close those within 6 months. The companies that I've worked with who have been through the JSA all knew they had good security before they went through the assessment. And 2 of them had already been through a DIPCAC high. The third company, a very large and prominent company, received a letter 3 or 4 months ago from DIPCAC saying, we have decided that we're going to do a DIPCAC high assessment of you. This means it's not an option. And that letter also said, no, we can do it, or you can choose to have us do it with a C3PAO as a joint surveillance assessment. So what do? Well, essentially, the first thing you should do is do a capable self-assessment. Some companies can do that themselves. Others should hire, a credentialed third-party consultant to do it. If you have a capable self-assessment, you're likely to see some things where you've got good documentation and evidence, and some things where you're not doing it, and some things where you think you're doing it, but the evidence isn't there. The objective is to essentially look at each of the 110 controls and be able to show that you have a practice or a policy or a technology that answers the requirements of answers each of the requirements. And although it's easy to write up, a volume of stuff that says I'm doing this, that, and the next thing for each of 110 requirements, that really isn't good enough, because it isn't just having the documentation is necessary, but you also have to show that you actually apply those policies and processes, and that the documentation is in fact exercised on actual contracts. They don't go off and check every contract. How could they? They don't go off and check every system. Not enough time in the world. But they do check a couple. They ask you to describe the boundaries of the information system, to give them an architecture of how you protect that system. They are almost always going to look at your system security plan, and then they're going to look to see the documentation of the policies, procedures, and processes for each of 110 controls. And they're going to do so making use of a companion document to SP 800-171. That is SP 800-171A, which provides the assessment methodology that NIST prepared for 171. And a closely related cousin of 171A is the CMMC Level 2 counterpart, which is the CMMC Level 2 Assessment Guide, and its companion, the CMMC Level 2 Scoping Guidance. So there's a lot of documentation out there that will not just tell the assessors what to do, but will tell you what you should do to be ready for and be confident that you can pass the assessment.
Okay. So you've spoken about how it takes time to get ready, You've talked to doing self-assessments, and doing everything you can in order to get yourself ready for potentially a third-party assessment. There's been a lot of, I think, uncertainty around costs and things of that nature. But what would you advise? Is there anything else that you would advise to companies in order to reduce their burden and try to manage costs and be as prepared as possible for when the moment comes that they are going to need to get that third-party assessment, whether it's now through a joint surveillance assessment or whether it's down the road when CMMC has actually been codified and you've got companies who will have to get that C3PAO to come in and assess them against level 2 in order to get that accreditation.
Well, again, every company is different, and we should never forget that. If it's a manufacturing company, some of the things in SP 800-171 just don't fit at all. So it is never a one size or 110 requirements equally, fit everyone. Doesn't work that way. But the first thing you need to know is whether you have CUI and whether you're subject to the 7012 clause. Item number 1, 7012 apply. Do I have CUI? Then if you have CUI, I'd kind of like to know where it is. And if you can, you might want to try to concentrate or isolate it into a particular system to which you might apply greater protection. You certainly want to have, some rules on how to determine whether information that isn't marked is or isn't CUI. Not an easy problem, and one that DoD has not chosen. Then you need to do that self-assessment competently. And you need to consider kind of where you are after the self-assessment, because the result will essentially tell you what your strategy should be. Is your strategy, one, to work over 3, 6, 12, or 18 months to become compliant 171? It could be. And if you have such a strategy, you need a plan to accompany it. That plan should have milestones of what you achieve by which time. It should have budget. It should have, governance, and it should have executive approval. Because if you know that you have a problem and you don't have any budget and your executives aren't interested and they don't approve the project, you will not become more secure. You'll essentially have documented your vulnerability. Not good. So once you have the strategy and you have that plan to achieve the strategy, well, as part of that, you want to consider what are your options, let's call them structurally. One option is to hire IT people and put consultants on the payroll and essentially build up the perimeter defenses and improve your on-premises system so that you do it yourself better than you were. Maybe. But that's not the way that most of industry is going. Industry, as well as DoD and the federal civilian agencies, they are increasingly looking to external service providers who might just provide, ordinary IT system advice, but there's kind of a scale. You can have managed service providers who can do an awful lot to help you with security and compliance. You can have managed security as a service providers who do very special and different things, such as incident and event management or endpoint detection and response. You can have cloud service providers to which you move all of your functions, and you essentially take advantage of the higher security that's provided by the CSP. And increasingly, there are a number of different ways in which you can get enclaves that are offered by or hosted by the big CSPs and operated by someone else, like Exostar. So there's a lot of choices. You need to make those choices after you're informed of kind of where you are, what you've got, what your present status of sufficiency is, and kind of what you want and can afford to do for your business. Doing nothing is not a good option, but there are going to be choices that are more or less costly, and there are going to be resources that are better qualified or less qualified. So you need to make intelligent, informed decisions so that you get the most for your money. And to me, that is likely to push most companies towards the use of one form of external service provider or another.
You talked earlier about the potential liabilities around if your score that you report to SIPRs is found to be inaccurate. What would happen if a company actually passes a CMMC assessment but still suffers a successful cyber attack? Would the company be liable? And we know that executives are also on the hook here when it comes to reporting. So would they be liable? And would insurance for either the company or the individual executives be an option?
Okay, well, there is no level of cybersecurity investment you can take or measures you can employ that are proof against every attack can't be done. Because history has shown us that there can be new, ingenious, and persistent threat actors who can come up with ways of entry, ways of exploitation that weren't previously contemplated. It's a fact. But the standard isn't the existence of the attack. If the attack occurs, then you look at, what did you do versus what was the standard of care. If you have gone through a CMMC assessment or a joint surveillance assessment, and you are found to have satisfied the 110 requirements that are presently checked, that's actually evidence that would help to show that you did satisfy a relevant standard of care. And if you have nothing to show that you are self-aware, nothing to show that you've done a self-assessment, nothing to show that management is alert to your cyber vulnerability, if you do nothing and suffer an attack, it becomes easier, I think, for your shareholders, your contracting partners, your lenders, or regulatory agencies to decide that you or people whose information is compromised, individuals, the situation that produces forms of third-party liability or high exposure to first-party losses is one where you've done nothing to protect yourself, nothing to prepare for an attack, nothing to prepare to recover from an attack, and you're left to fend as best you can after the event. I said at the outset that insurance is really important, and insurance can cover not only the enterprise, but also individuals at the enterprise. You can lose the benefit of insurance. I've seen it. There are cases about it. If you tell an insurance carrier that, yes, you do multi-factor authentication on everything, and you know you don't, and you in fact have never done it, well, if they find something where you misled the carrier in getting your policy, they will deny coverage and you will be forced to litigate in an attempt to get it. If you are a CISO and you knowingly mislead a regulatory agency about the source, nature, consequence of an attack or the injury, you could even find yourself criminally prosecuted. That's what happened to the CISO of Uber. Now, what's the smart move? Well, the smart move is the prudent move. Don't do bad things. Don't have willful blindness. Be aware of the threat environment. Take responsible actions. Get management involved. Have a governance process. Be sure you have funds. Keep track of your progress. And if you have to make tough decisions, or you have to make a call as to how to do enough in a situation where you can't do everything, you always want to document your decision to show it's reasonable. So you want that documentation prepared at the time you make those decisions. Again, wearing my hat as a litigator, I have found over decades that the worst kind of evidence to explain a contested action is the utterances of the official when they are challenged or sued, at the time of deposition or trial. If you don't have it written down, explained, and understandable at the time the critical decisions were made, well, then you don't have good evidence. And evidence counts for a lot. It counts for a lot in minimizing your liability risk. It also counts for a lot in showing that you have the proper documentation to earn a high assessment when the time comes.
I've been speaking with Rogers Joseph O'Donnell's Bob Metzger, a leading voice on the DoD cybersecurity landscape. Bob, you have given our audience a wealth of valuable insight today. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.